Hey everybody, this is my thoughts on Hard Reset Redux. This is a new and improved version of the original Hard Reset, which was developed by Flying Wild Hog, and I already did a review of that, so what this is basically going to talk about is the new and improved features of Redux. Now, full disclaimer here, I was given a review copy of this to take a look at, so I do appreciate that, because quite honestly, I probably wouldn't have picked the Redux version up otherwise. Now, while the original game was released in July of 2012, this version was released in June 2016, and they boast that the visuals have been enhanced, which I can barely tell a difference between this and the original Hard Reset. That's not necessarily a bad thing, because the original Hard Reset looked pretty damn good for its day, and in fact it still looks pretty damn good in terms of pure visual quality. It had some really fantastic lighting and particle effects and things like that, and that does carry over into the Redux version, although again, you can barely tell a difference between this and the original game in terms of the visual quality. Although in the case of the cyber katana they introduce in the Redux version, the hand textures are actually pretty awful, so there is that. But apart from a few texture issues, the game looks pretty good. Its cyberpunk aesthetic works rather well for it, and even though it does have a bit of a color problem, namely the fact that while there are a bunch of neon lights, and those actually look rather nice, most of the environments are just various shades of gray, and that does become rather tiresome after a while. Now, they do also boast that the performance has been improved, namely the load times, and I can confirm that the load times are certainly faster than they were in the original game, which is greatly appreciated because they could drag on a bit in the original game. But other than that, it does run pretty much the same as the original, which means that it runs rather well. There's no real slowdown issues. In fact, even when there's a ton of stuff going on screen at once, it never really hitches at all. And it does scale rather well with hardware. I mean, the minimum system requirements are a friggin' 8800. Yes, a game released in 2016 that has a minimum requirement of an 8800 GS or an Radeon HD 3870. It requires a minimum of a Pentium 4 2.5 GHz. So performance isn't exactly something I was worried about, but it is nice to see the load times were improved at least. But beyond that, the presentation really didn't receive much of an upgrade. If anything, it regressed in some aspect of the texture quality, but they're mostly only noticeable to the absolute purists. Well, with the notable exception of the hands when you're using the cyber katana, but that's pretty much the only one you're gonna outright notice pretty easily. The rest of the presentation remains mostly unchanged, which means that the awful voice acting is still there, the weapon sounds are still exactly as they were in the original game, with the exception of the new cyber katana, which sounds kind of like a lightsaber when you swing it around. But the other weapons don't really have enough oomph to them. The physical projectile weapon has somewhat resembling gun sounds, but mostly it just sounds kind of weak. The explosions that it creates, and the explosions in general, are really lacking in bass in particular, so instead of rocking you around, they just end up sounding more like dull thuds than anything else. Then there's the energy weapon, which sounds suitably like an energy weapon. It has a lot of pew-pew noises and electric arcing noises, and they work fine for it. It's just that they don't sound particularly powerful. But while that's slightly disappointing, it's not really a deal breaker, and the music certainly helps the sound design quite a bit because it's a bunch of hard rock or metal inspired stuff. And while it's not exactly the most memorable soundtrack, in the moment it actually works very well because you've got a lot of action going on, and the hard rock and metal instrumentals really do help to ramp that up. But what doesn't get ramped up quite as much are the story and the gameplay. In fact, the story is exactly the same as it was in the original game, so there's not really anything to talk about there. And quite frankly, the story is so incredibly forgettable that you won't even really care about it anyway. So what's ultimately going to make or break this thing for you is the gameplay itself. Now, this is a semi-old-school first-person shooter. I say that because it takes more from the Serious Sam gameplay style than it does from, say, Doom or Quake. You end up with a lot of enemies on screen at once, and you'll run into an area, the area will close off, all these enemies will spawn in, you have to deal with all of them, and then once you've killed them all, you get to move on to the next area and repeat the process. And along the way, you collect a bunch of nano currency that will allow you to upgrade your weapons once you hit a certain threshold and get an upgrade point for them. And that's important because you only have two specific weapons. You have the CLN and the NRG. One of them is a physical projectile-based weapon that starts off as just a simple machine gun, but later on gives you access to unlocking a shotgun version, as well as a rocket launcher, grenade launcher, or a proximity mine launcher. The other one is an energy-based weapon that starts off as a basic plasma gun that can eventually be upgraded to also have modes to be a railgun, an electric arc caster, an energy mortar, or a seeking shot, which is basically just an energy shot that goes off and seeks a target, but it's actually less useful than it sounds. And that's how the original game was. Redux introduces the Cyber Katana, which is just a basic melee weapon that has a light attack and a heavy attack, and it's pretty much useless against everything except for the weakest enemies, so unless you're trying to finish something off and you're trying to conserve ammo, which you don't really need to do in this game anyway, then it really just clogs up your inventory, and instead of being able to switch right back and forth between your energy and projectile weapons, you end up having to switch between energy projectile and the Cyber Katana, because there is no quick select option for the CLN, the NRG, or the Cyber Katana. This means that you might want to switch immediately to a rocket launcher, and instead of having to press the button and then just immediately going to whichever attachment you're wanting to use, you have to cycle through the energy weapon and then maybe the katana and then get to your projectile weapon, then switch it over. So oddly enough, the Cyber Katana becomes more of a liability than anything else, and it feels like a really, really cheap attempt at shoehorning a feature from Shadow Warrior into this. Which I guess is reasonable considering that the katana was one of the really, really cool features in the reboot of Shadow Warrior, but in this game it just feels like a cheap addition that's trying to garner favor from Shadow Warrior fans. It doesn't work anywhere near as well as the Shadow Warrior katana and isn't anywhere near as satisfying to use. In fact, none of the weapons in this game are particularly satisfying to use, partly because the enemies in general are kind of bullet spongy. And that was something that was a problem in the original game as well, although it was a much bigger problem than that because they were even more bullet spongy, and they would also swarm you and tend to do a lot of damage to you, which meant that you died fairly often in the original game. This is much more manageable. They changed the enemy placements, they changed them to not be anywhere near as bullet spongy as they used to be, and they also introduced the dash maneuver, which is a godsend because the movement speed in the original hard reset was absolutely glacial. It was pretty infuriating just how incredibly slow you were in the original game and how sluggish everything felt. In Redux, it's definitely a lot better in that regard, but your movement speed is still very, very slow. Luckily, they introduced the dash maneuver, which quickly becomes your favorite method of moving because you never really run out of dash, and you can also move faster by using the dash than you can by actually walking or sprinting. And that combined with the changed enemy placements where you're introduced to the tougher enemies earlier on in the game than you were before, and you end up with a lot of your weapons rather quickly, means that ultimately this is definitely an improved version of Hard Reset. There's only one problem with that. If you're like me and you just didn't like Hard Reset to begin with, then this is not really going to win you over. It's still got rather crappy writing, the gunplay is still rather tedious even though they have made the enemies much less bullet spongy than they used to be. The enemy designs in general are still pretty lame and uninteresting because the vast majority of them are just robots that don't really do anything particularly interesting. And the addition of the cyborg zombies, which are just plain old zombies, is downright lazy. And the level design is still pretty uninspired. The game's length isn't particularly long, so it doesn't really hold a lot of value for what it is. And it certainly isn't a proper old school shooter. It's clearly inspired by Serious Sam and its ilk, but it's not really anything beyond that. There basically ends up being nothing in this game that it does better than Serious Sam, or even does anywhere near the level of Serious Sam, so it ends up being a matter of, well, why would I play this when I can pick up something like Serious Sam and have a ton of fun with it because it has plenty of personality, it has good level design, it has good weapon design and things like that, or even just pick up the reboot of Shadow Warrior, which takes the few elements of Hard Reset that actually did work and makes them not only better, but it contextualizes them in a game that has tons of personality. Hard Reset just doesn't have much personality to it at all, and that still plagues the Redux version even with the improvements that they did make to the gameplay mechanics. While it is definitely improved over the original, the Redux version is still ultimately a pretty bland and boring first-person shooter when you really get down to it. There's so many other better options out there, including other options from Flying Wild Hog. And ultimately, the only reason I can possibly recommend this game is if you get it for really cheap, which if you do own the original Hard Reset, or if you own Shadow Warrior, the reboot anyway, then you actually do get an 85% discount on Steam. And as I'm recording this video, the 2016 Steam Summer Sale is going on right now, and this game is $3, which is an even deeper discount. So if you're looking for a cheap option of first-person shooters and you haven't played Hard Reset, then maybe you can give it a try and get something out of it. I got basically nothing out of it other than, oh hey, it's Hard Reset, but at least slightly better than it was before. But if you're like me and you didn't like the original Hard Reset, this isn't gonna win you over. It's just more of the same, but slightly better, and slightly better really isn't good enough if you've already played through it. Even then, I will still have a link in the video description box where you can pick this up if you're interested. Thanks for watching.